We are back. The third and final lecture for the sensation and perception topic. We've spent a lot of time talking about vision. Why would we do that? Well, vision's really important, obviously, but audition researchers often get offended if you say vision's more important. Certainly an argument could be made that audition is equally important as vision. The problem is more people study vision than study audition, so there's just more learned about it scientifically. And that's true as well for gustation, or the sense of taste, olfaction, the sense of smell, and touch and pain. These are very important aspects of sensation and perception as well. They just receive a bit less attention than vision does.
So we're going to start off by what sound is. So it's a wave of pressure that's caused by object vibrations. So when an object vibrates, it moves the air molecules. And when those air molecules are moving, they cause a wave. Now, sound is a perceptual experience. Okay? It does not exist separate from the perceiver. So if you make a sound in a vacuum, okay, you won't hear anything. And this was first discovered by a man named Boyle back in the 17th century. He put an alarm clock in a jar and then sucked out all of the air from that jar. And there was no sound in it. And when he started to slowly let the air back in, all of a sudden the sound could be heard. Okay? It requires a perceiver to actually have the sense organ that can detect the changes in air molecules.
Okay, so there's a couple of important properties of sounds, just to get a basic understanding of the process. The first dimension is amplitude, and that's determined by the height of sound waves. The more amplitude is perceived as a higher intensity sound by the individual, so amplitude determines, from the perceptual perspective, the perception of loudness. And you can measure that with a decibel meter, which measures not surprisingly, measures the intensity of sound in decibels.
Frequency is the other important characteristic of a sound, and it's determined by the wavelength of sound waves. Okay, so this is the number of times per second that a wave will cycle through a high peak and a low point. Okay, so this is frequency, and it's measured in hertz. Now, the higher the frequency of a sound wave, the higher in pitch that sound is going to be perceived. The lower the frequency, the lower the pitch is going to be. So, as you can see on the slide, a high-pitched sound would be wind chimes, and a low-pitched sound would be a tuba.
Now, the third thing, you'll notice the overlap with vision. Vision also depends on the wavelength and the amplitude and the complexity of the wavelengths that go into the visual stimulus that you're perceiving. Well, sound waves also have that third dimension as well that's important. Complexity is important for the perception of sound, and it's determined by the ranges of wavelengths in a sound wave. And this complex combination of wavelengths determines the sound's timbre. And that's how you pronounce it, everyone. It's not timbre, it's pronounced timbre. And I should note that in life, almost all of the sounds that you encounter will vary in terms of the combination of wavelengths involved. It's very rare in nature to be exposed to something that's a pure sound frequency. So almost all of the sounds we hear vary in terms of the ranges and the combination of wavelengths that go into the sound. One wavelength is that pure tone. It's the purest sound. It's the kind of things that singers go for, just hit the note in the purest way possible. But in real life, the sounds consist of these multiple frequencies.
So an example of what timbre is, if you think of different instruments, they could all play the same note. So if you have a piano and a flute playing the same note, it's going to sound very different from each other, and they'd sound different from other instruments. And this is because even though you're trying to produce the same note, they produce a different pattern of sound frequencies. So it's this combination of sound frequencies that provides the timbre.
So just a visual. So imagine some object in the world makes a sound, and it's going to cause the molecules in the air to emanate from that source throughout the environment. And that's what our ears are sensitive to. It allows us to perceive the sounds that we hear in the environment. So the wavelength of the sound that's coming from an object is based on the distance between the two peaks. The more the sound cycles up to down across time, the higher the frequency of the sound and the higher pitch it seems to us. And it's the height from the top of the sound to the midpoint of the sound wave that gives it its amplitude. The higher the sound wave goes up and down across the midpoint, the more intense the sound is perceived by us to be.
So here's a diagram of what the ear looks like. So as you can see, the sound enters through the pinna, that's that flap on the outside of your ear. It then travels through the auditory canal. Now that's considered the external ear. Now we're going to be discussing each of these components in more detail in the next few slides. But just to give you an overview here, the middle ear is composed of the eardrum. Okay, and you can see the eardrum. Let me see. There we go. So the eardrum and then these three small bones, the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. Now the stirrup taps on the oval window, which then leads into the inner ear.
Okay, so here's the oval window and here's the inner ear. This is a sort of a bisection of the inner ear, which is curled around, just kind of looks like a snail here. Consists mainly of the cochlea. This is the structure called the cochlea. It looks like a snail. In fact, I think the word cochlea means snail, interestingly enough. And if you cut this baby in half, then you get what's called in the middle here the basilar membrane. And then on the other side is a membrane and attached to that membrane are a bunch of these little hair cells all along the length of the cochlea. And then imagine this cochlea is filled with fluid, and so every time there's a tap on the oval window, the fluid in this membrane starts to form a wave through the length of across the length of the basilar membrane, and the wave causes these hair cells to jiggle along this other membrane here.
Okay, now we're going to go through the different components of the ear. So the outer ear, its purpose is to collect the sound waves and send them towards the middle ear. Now the pinna is also really important in localizing sounds. So the pinna provides this unique way of tunneling the sounds into that your auditory canal. And they've done studies where they have people localize sounds. If they actually record the sounds once they've gone through the pinna and they're in the auditory canal, and they play those same sounds to other people, they can't localize those sounds anymore because the sound has been distorted by your pinna. Okay, so each outer ear shapes the sounds in slightly different ways. The middle ear is where the sound wave vibrates the eardrum at the same amplitude and frequency. So this causes the three bones inside the middle ear to tap out on the oval window of the inner ear.
Now the inner ear consists of, as I was mentioning before, the cochlea. It's that basilar membrane is the one on one side that the movement triggers the movement of hair cells, which are all located on that other strip of membrane, which is known as the organ of Corti. Those hair cells, or cilia is another name for them, moves and ultimately will send signals along through the auditory nerve along to the brain to tell you about what's the nature of the sounds that you're listening to. That stirrup that taps on the oval window, as I mentioned before, sends waves of fluid along the cochlea, causing the basilar membrane to move, which then again affects the movement of the hair cells. And the number or the intensity and location of the hair cells determines the perception of the sounds, that you experience perceptually. too many perceptions in that one.
Okay, so as Jason said, those hair cells are going to be bent. Now, as that wave is traveling down the basilar membrane, where it peaks at its strongest point, that's where those hair cells are going to be bent the most. And they're going to send a signal to the brain along the auditory nerve about the frequency and the amplitude of the sound that's coming in. So as you go along the basilar membrane, it changes in frequency. So depending on where along the basilar membrane the wave peaks, that determines the hair cells that fire the most.
And so here just indicates what kinds of sounds people are sensitive to according to the frequency of the sound and according to the loudness of it. So how loud does a sound have to be for you to hear it, depending on what frequency it is? And you can see that a sound that's very low in frequency, down here at 20 hertz, is very hard to detect unless it's presented very loudly. And in fact, below 20 hertz, it's really very impossible almost to hear sounds at that frequency at all.
You perceive any sound below 20 hertz as a vibration. And above 20,000 hertz, the only individuals that can hear it are children and dogs.
And so now in contrast, these sounds that are between, let's say, 1,000 and 5,000 hertz, they don't have to be that loud at all for us to become sensitive to them, to be able to perceive them. And so that's the sounds in this frequency range are the lowest sounds that are audible to the human ear. And as you move up to sounds that are louder, in just to give you an idea of what these decibels refer to, 80 up here is subway or heavy city traffic, an alarm clock going off to wake you up, factory noise. So that's pretty loud, and we're just not sensitive even to low frequency sounds. Even at that level, we're not sensitive to them if they're at a lower frequency than 20 hertz.
Okay, now we're going to move on to taste. Now, if you feel your tongue, you're going to notice a lot of little tiny bumps, and these are called papillae. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Papillae.
Papillae. Okay, and these contain your taste buds. Now, the taste receptors are fibers that are found inside of these taste buds. And these taste receptors provide information about the basic taste. And these are based on the chemicals that are in your mouth. So the basic taste would be salty, sour, bitter, sweet, and some say umami, which is considered...
Well, that's a taste that's really associated with Asian cooking, and it's more of a savory kind of a taste that's hard to describe without using the word umami. Tastes are really hard to describe in words. But think of things that have a lot of food dishes that have a lot of MSG. That's going to be high in umami. It's one of the main functions of MSG is to give food a savory, good taste. And umami's the Japanese name for that.
And people actually vary on how many taste buds they have. So as you get older, you lose some of your taste buds. So that's why if you ask someone really old to cook something for you, they're going to probably make it a bit stronger than what you'd be accustomed to, because they're not going to be as sensitive to these tastes as you are. So they're going to have to add extra spices. But remember, kids have more taste buds than adults. So when a child says that something tastes bad, it probably does taste bad to them. And there are some people known as super tasters, and they can have between 4 and 10 times as many taste buds, taste receptors, as the normal person. So for them, water could be considered very sweet.
Yeah, and just to comment as a former super taster and somebody that's the father of a super taster, just generally we should be more sensitive to children, the different taste experiences that children have, because it can be quite dramatically different. A child can say, oh, that's too strong. Something that adults would consider completely bland is just too much for some kids to handle, especially these super taster kids, and can actually make them quite nauseous. But the tendency is to encourage kids to try it anyways and to eat it despite the fact that it might really be an upsetting experience for them, because you've got to power through it, right? The attitude is eat whatever's put in front of you. Well, that's okay for maybe even most kids, that's okay. But some number of kids are going to be super tasters, and you're actually going to traumatize them in some cases. And you will encounter cases where children will actually get sick because of feeding them food that you might experience as bland.
This is a very embarrassing story, but I had picked up some dinner for my daughter, who is a super taster, and she really likes chicken fingers. So I got her some chicken fingers, and she took a bite of them and said they were too strong, they were too spicy. I thought, they can't possibly be spicy. They're just from McDonald's or Burger King, someplace where it was quite bland. So I took a bite of it, and I said, it's fine, why don't you try it again? Like, maybe you'll like it better this time. And she took another bite, and she ended up getting sick. And she said, it's just too spicy. So I felt completely horrible, and she will probably never forget that experience. So if you encounter a super taster, if they tell you it makes them feel sick or it's too spicy, you have to take their word for it. Your perceptions are uniquely your own. So with children, we have to be a little more understanding about their tastes.
So just because we all like a picture, this is a picture of somebody's tongue, and you can see all the bumps on there. Papillae, different papillae on the surface of your tongue. And if you blow up one of these bumps, a section of one of these bumps to a really big size, you get an idea of what your tongue looks like under, let's say, an electron microscope or something. In here are your taste buds. So the stuff that you eat dissolves and sort of drips into these crevices here, makes contact with your taste buds, and then the molecules in the food will bind with some of the taste buds to indicate, to tell you the specific taste properties of whatever it is that you're eating. And so depending on the taste bud, it'll be more or less sensitive to the different basic taste features: salty, sweet, sour, or bitter. And across the surface of the tongue, the proportion of those different types of taste buds differs, so that you can see this section of the tongue will be most sensitive to the taste of bitter things, whereas down here, this part of the tongue will have taste buds that are more sensitive to the salty molecules that indicate that the thing that you're eating is salty.
Now, there's several factors that determine taste. So the first one would be that unique combination of basic tastes, so those different chemicals. And anyone who's ever tried to cook would know this. You add different flavors because you want to get that unique combination that'll make something taste great. But another one is temperature. So imagine a glass of milk. Now, if I'm going to drink milk, I want it really cold. If there's a warm glass of milk, it's not going to taste the same. I think it tastes disgusting. Even though the chemicals may be the same, the temperature can influence it. And the third one you can see is texture. So imagine that glass of milk, but now it's really cold, okay? But instead of being liquidy, it's lumpy. If someone gave you lumpy milk to taste that was cold, do you think it would taste the same as a nice regular glass of cold milk? And the last factor is smell. Smell is very important. If you've ever had a cold and you've been really congested, you can't smell anything, you'll probably notice that food tastes really bland. And this is because smell contributes a lot to our sense of taste. Something as basic as coffee. Who would miss the taste of coffee? But if you give people a taste of coffee without the smell associated with it, people have a really hard time identifying it.
And also, people have done experiments whether folks can identify certain tastes when they're unable to smell the food as well. And things like apple and potato and vanilla, those kind of tastes, people can often lose the ability entirely to identify them if they don't have the ability to perceive the smell of it at the same time. So, an important factor in taste. this slide is just to indicate that taste is something that's a bottom-up process. It's based in the dissolving of dissolving of food into liquid form on the tongue, and then we sense the features of it, and that gives us the experience of taste. But what tastes good does vary from one culture to the next, so you can't deny a role of learning here. You've got grubs for many North Americans. These are really disgusting looking to many of us. Larvae, you would eat these kind of things. Are you crazy? But this is a cultural staple for some, or food staple for some cultures. Some Inuit children eating the fish eyes. That's good eating if you're an Inuit children. Several tribes in East Africa commonly drink blood. These tastes from a Western cultural perspective seem quite strange and bizarre, but just recognize the influence of a person's learning experience and the environment that they grow up in determining their taste preferences. Okay, so the next sense that we'll talk about is called olfaction, your ability to smell. How does this occur? What is the basic process that's involved in smell? Well, the things in our environment, they give off molecules into the air, and the neurons at the upper part of the nasal passage detect the presence of these chemical molecules in the air, and they give us all the varied smell experiences that we have every day. So a rose smells the way it does because it releases molecules that bind to these neurons that exist at the upper part of the nasal passage, and those neurons send a message off to the brain saying, hey, you're smelling a rose. Now, the information about the presence of these molecules are sent to the brain's olfactory bulb through the olfactory nerve. Everything's olfactory. That keeps it all simple. So if you can look at this as not coincidentally, a picture of a rose here, giving off its rosy type molecules that are going to go up into your nose, and it's going to meet the neuron olfactory neuron fibers that are right here at the roof of the nasal passage, and those neurons are going to send a message to this olfactory bulb here in your brain via the olfactory nerve.
So far, they've identified over 1,000 different smell receptors, okay, that are sensitive to unique smells.
Okay, well, we talked about the basic 5 senses everybody knows about. The 6th sense, of course, is the ability to read minds. Or
I thought it was seeing dead people.
Seeing dead people? Oh, yeah, that's right. Well, there's a variety of 6th senses that have been proposed, but no evidence for them exists. But a couple of senses where there is a lot of evidence for that are additional to the 5 senses are called the vestibular and kinesthetic senses. The vestibular sense is reliant also on the ear, the inner ear. There's fluid-filled structures in the inner ear that are kind of attached to that cochlea I was talking about, the saccule, utricle, and semicircular canals. And the way the fluid sloshes around in the inner ear, that tells your body important information about your position relative to gravity. That is, are you standing upright? Are you lying down? Are you falling over? This is a very important sense to tell you all about balance and how well balanced you are.
The kinesthetic sense is your ability to know where the different parts of your body are relative to one another. Now, if you don't have this sense, it can leave you like a rag doll. And that's what happened to a woman named Christina, who was a patient of Dr. Oliver Sacks. He's a famous doctor. He would deal with these neurological patients. And she had damage to her kinesthetic nerve fibers. So she was literally like a rag doll. She couldn't control her muscles. So these receptors in your joints, your muscles, and your tendons, they all provide this important information about the position of your body parts.
Well, okay, I have one for vestibular sense too then. You can really experience disruptions to your vestibular sense by drinking a lot of alcohol, because that impairs the ability for your brain to interpret the signals coming from coming from the fluid in that inner ear that I was talking about. So you can chemically disrupt the vestibular sense, but also anytime you'll notice that anytime pressure changes in your inner ear because you're in an airplane and it's changing its altitude quite rapidly, you'll experience a sense of dizziness. You'll have trouble, you'll be perfectly still and perfectly balanced, but you'll have trouble staying upright because that part of your inner ear that's telling your brain about balance gets disrupted by changes in pressure. It affects the fluid without a change in your actual balance, which can really throw you off. Now, touch perception. It's the last type of sense perception that we'll talk about. Am I right?
Pain perception.
Oh, and pain. Well, very associated with touch perception. The skin contains receptors that provide the brain with information about pressure and temperature, whether you're touching something relatively hot versus cold, and pain. So here's looks like a chimpanzee. Oh, orangutan. I'm going to go with orangutan arm. And I just present this. You can ignore the inhibitory, excitatory aspect of this for our purposes. We don't want to burden you with it. But just the point is that this orangutan is going to have sensory receptors all along the arm, and of course all over the rest of its body, that through those somatic nerves, or those sensory nerves that we talked about in earlier lectures, it's going to send a signal off to the brain. It's going to give this orangutan the experience that it's being touched by something or someone.
Okay, now we're going to talk about the perception of pain. So pain signals damage to your body tissue, and it's really important. If you aren't able to detect damage to your body, even something small like an infection or something larger like a broken bone, it can lead to death if you don't get it treated. So any of these really small injuries can become much worse because you don't accommodate for the injury. So people have died because they haven't been able to experience pain. Now, a strange thing about pain is that you can't just measure the amount of tissue damage and then know how much pain the person's experiencing, because the pain experience is going to be more or less intense depending on the circumstances.
Right, and as Lana was mentioning, that in some cases the inability to experience pain can cause more and more damage because a person isn't sensitive to when they injure themselves. And that's part of the problems with leprosy, that people lose the fibers in their skin and the senses in their skin to tell them that they're causing damage to their body, and they can ultimately end up with huge, horrible disfigurations for this reason. So this idea that the intensity of pain can depend on the circumstance, some sense has been made of this fact by what's known as the gate control theory of pain. But just in real life terms, can I give you a concrete example that would illustrate this? Well, you might get whacked in the shin just walking around in everyday life, just walking down the street. You might take somebody come up to you and kick you in the shin. That would hurt. Boy, would that hurt. But when people are playing hockey or football, or they're engaged in some other competitive sport and they accidentally get hit in the shin, yeah, it might hurt, but they seem to be able to shake it off really quickly. It doesn't seem to cause nearly as much pain as it would in other situations. Well, how would that ever happen? Why is it that the same amount of damage to a person's body would cause such a different experience? Intense pain in one case, and sort of brief pain followed by get back to the hockey game in another context. And the idea is that there's some gate in the spinal cord that can either block or accept messages about pain from the rest of the body. Without any tissue damage, the gate's always shut, so a person doesn't experience any pain. But when you experience tissue damage, the gate opens, causing the experience of pain. Only the higher centers in the brain, under certain circumstances, can close the gate even when there's tissue damage occurring. Okay, and so that's the case if you're engaged in a highly competitive sport and you get kicked somewhere, somebody punches you, your gate is closed because you can't really worry about the pain. You haven't got time for the pain. So you've got a closed gate in that case that prevents you from experiencing the pain from that tissue damage.
Now, the gate control theory of pain doesn't explain the perception of pain when you don't have any tissue damage. Okay, because remember, it's tissue damage that signals that the pain is there and it opens up the gate. But people can experience pain even when they're in a limb that they don't have anymore. So if you have been injured and had a leg amputated, we'd call this and you have pain where you used to have a leg, we'd call this phantom limb pain. Okay, but it couldn't have been accounted for by the gate control theory of pain because you don't have any tissue that should be signaling damage and opening up the gate. Now, others have suggested that the reason you might feel this phantom limb pain is that you're getting abnormal information from the body. So the brain's sending out signals, move this leg, the leg's not moving. Okay, so it's abnormal. So because you're not getting any input from your efforts to move this amputated limb, that can be interpreted as painful.
Yeah, it's like your brain is permanently upset by the fact that a limb that was there before is no longer there. And I mean, anybody who has had an amputation knows what it's like and how bizarre it is. You can actually have sensations of your big toe when you don't even have a leg at all. It's really that realistic and very frustrating if there's a tickle or an itch or a pain there, but the toe's not actually there, the foot's not there. That's very frustrating. What can you do? You can't itch something that's not there. There's no way to get rid of the itch. It's infuriating. Okay, so that's our discussion of the different senses, and you must be aware that we can only provide the most basic of information about the processes that go into the sensation of tastes and smells and sounds and visual objects and the perceptual processes involved, because you could devote an entire course to each of these topics. Okay, this is an intro psych class, so we got to keep it pretty basic. But the thing we're going to leave you off with is this issue of, to what extent do perceptions that occur unconsciously, that you're not aware of, to what extent do they influence a person's behavior or their preferences? And it's not like unconscious things that you perceive unconsciously don't have any effect, because they do. This is alarming to some people. You might actually have things going on in your environment that you're not aware of that are still influencing you. Advertisers love this idea because they can get you to buy things then, and you don't even know why you want to buy it. So unfortunately, though, unconscious influences on our perceptions do affect our behavior, at least to some extent. Here's a couple of examples. The mere exposure effect. If you flash a face at a person so quickly that they're not even aware that they saw it, nonetheless, later, if you have them rate the attractiveness of that face, they'll tend to rate that face as more attractive than some other face that they didn't have flashed at them below the level of awareness. So your preference, that's not only true of faces, but you can do this with words, you can do this with geometric shapes, you can do this with brand names. So that you're actually, even though you encountered a stimulus that you weren't even aware was shown to you, it can boost your preferences for that thing. And priming is another demonstration of this. Psychologists spend a lot of time doing priming experiments in which, as one example, you can unconsciously expose a series of personality traits to a participant in an experiment, like honesty and smart or liar. So things that are sort of all related to the same kind of a trait. And then if you show a person immediately after and have them judge them on a variety of personality traits, they'll rate them higher on the trait that you unconsciously exposed them to earlier. So the unconscious priming seems to activate interpretations that are consistent, honesty-related interpretations, and you actually start to perceive the person you encounter after that as more honest. But it's really any personality trait. It could be dishonest that you prime them, then you would think the person's more shady.
Here's an example of an ad. So you might see this ad in any magazine, break out the frosty bottle. But now I want you to take a look at the cup on the right. Do you notice anything different about it? Look closely and you'll see an S, E, and the X down below. So it's spelling out sex, but at a level where you shouldn't be aware of it, okay, unless someone draws your attention to it. And they're hoping that that's going to make you associate sex with their brand. Okay, so it's going to make you feel good about the product.
Yeah, but the idea is that they want to do it unconsciously because they're afraid that if you know they're trying to do it, that it won't work. And that's often the way it is with messages that are meant to be sent unconsciously. Once you're aware of them, you can engage in processes that allow you to overcome their influence. The trick is to get the messages in there unconsciously so that you're never aware of them and so that the association's just there and you don't know why. All of a sudden you think Gilby's gin is sexy now. You're not really sure why. You just do, and the idea is that you'll be more likely to buy it. So just, does this work? Does this kind of thing actually work in terms of behavior? And it does sometimes, and there's some evidence that it can. So here's an example of the results of an experiment in which subliminally, below the level of awareness, Lipton iced tea was presented to people. They weren't aware of its presentation. And then they measured people on whether or not they were thirsty. And then they measured people's likelihood of choosing Lipton iced tea over some other comparable brand of iced tea. And so you can find that, okay, when people are not thirsty, the likelihood of choosing Lipton iced tea, it's about 50%, but they're only about 31% at choosing something that's not Lipton iced tea. But if they're thirsty, now they're way up close to 90% to choose Lipton iced tea and hardly at all likely to choose the neutral word that's not related to Lipton iced tea. So that's the mere exposure effect. Just exposing unconsciously and information to people makes it more preferable to them, at least immediately after, if there's not much of a delay. So there's the power of unconscious perception for you.
Okay, so you have seen that there is an influence of unconscious perception. However, there's no evidence that someone's behavior can be radically changed or controlled just by information presented outside of their conscious awareness. So if you get flashed subliminally, quit smoking or exercise more, it's not going to work. Anyone who thought they could buy those tapes to learn how to speak a new language and play them while they're sleeping, that's not going to work either. Okay, there's no evidence that people's behavior can be radically changed, and it's not going to be controlled either by these unconscious influences. So you're not going to join a cult just because someone flashes join a cult to you subliminally.
However, it might provide just a slight advantage for one brand over another in the grocery store. It won't cause you to go run out and buy Lipton iced tea if you're not in the store. But maybe the next time you go to the store, you're more likely to reach for Lipton iced tea than you are for some other brand.
And you notice that in those results Jason showed you, the effect was much stronger when people were thirsty. So if you already have a tendency to want something, then you can be nudged in a consistent direction towards one brand.
And it's also not clear how long that kind of a thing lasts. So it's quite possible that over an hour or so delay, these effects would not be present, and you actually wouldn't be influenced in the grocery store. Most of these experiments that show evidence for the mere exposure effect have the person make their judgments of preference shortly after the presentation of the unconscious presentation of that stimulus. It's quite possible there aren't any effects if you wait a bit longer.
Now, there's a video link. It's link number 2 in the Unit 3 links folder. And it has some examples of subliminal messages that have been embedded within real advertisements. All right, now, some of these images may be offensive to some viewers, so keep that in mind. You might not want to watch it if you're easily shocked.
Right, but these are, as offensive as they might be, these are real advertisements that actually have been out in the public and been available for public viewing. So just give you really what this is going to give you a sense of what advertisers are trying to pull on you. And some of it can be quite shocking, actually.